Very polite of you, thank you. I'd like to welcome all of you to our event tonight. I'm Chris Serpidon, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the University of New Orleans and Director of the Tocqueville Project. The Tocqueville Project is an academic research, public policy, and educational programming center here at the University of New Orleans. The project aims to follow the footsteps of French philosopher or French historian Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the most significant outside observers of moral and political life in the United States, by examining the enduring questions in the history of Western moral and political thought, and considering how answers to these questions affect social and political life in the United States right now. So our programming, including events like this discussion tonight, would not be possible without the support of a number of individuals and organizations, including the University of New Orleans Student Government Association, Charles Koch Foundation, the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, and the John Templeton Foundation. I'm also especially thankful to the support we received from many of my colleagues and other organizations here at the University of New Orleans. These include Robert DuPont, the chair of the Department of History and Philosophy, Kim Long, the dean of the College of Arts, Education, and Human Development, John Nicola, the president of the University of New Orleans, and Myra Mugazar, who is our provost, also here tonight. For tonight's event, I'm especially grateful to a number of other organizations and individuals who have made this event possible, including Johnny Burka and the folks at the American Conservative magazine, who made really all of this possible and have brought our speakers tonight. The University of New Orleans Founders Club, who provided our pre-event reception downstairs. And they're also part of the Homer Hit lecture series, which this event is now part of. Also to the generosity of John and Edith Slavik, my friend Ken Bickford, who many of you know, who helped us bring this event to UNO when it was originally going to be scheduled at another university that we won't name across town. So he helped us bring it here instead of over there. And so I promised him that our community here at the University of New Orleans is vibrant, that many people would be excited to attend tonight. And so given this turnout, I'm glad that you all showed that I was telling the truth when I made that claim to him. And so one of the aims of the Tocqueville Project is to bring a diversity of views to our campus. And that continues tonight. It is always an honor to have the opportunity to listen to a New York Times best-selling author to talk about a topic of current interest and significance. And tonight we're fortunate to have two. J.D. Vance is the author of Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis, which reached #1 on the New York Times best-selling list. It's a memoir about the Appalachian values of his upbringing and their relation to the social problems of his hometown. Vance grew up in the Rust Belt city of Middleton, Ohio, and the Appalachian town of Jackson, Kentucky. He enlisted in the Marine Corps after high school and served in Iraq before graduating from The Ohio State University and Yale Law School. Recently, J.D. moved back to his home state of Ohio to found our Ohio Renewal, a nonprofit dedicated to addressing the state's opioid crisis and bringing high-quality employment and educational opportunities to citizens of Ohio. Rod Dreher is the author of The Benedict Option, which reached #7 on the New York Times best-selling list, which calls on American Christians to prepare for the coming dark age by embracing an ancient Christian way of life. Dreher is a senior editor at the American Conservative, and he has written and edited for the New York Post, the Dallas Morning News, National Review, the Wall Street Journal. He's also appeared on NPR, ABC News, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and the BBC. Rod grew up in St. Francisville and currently resides in Baton Rouge. And so it's always nice having another local up here on stage with me. So please join me in welcoming J.D. Vance and Rod Dreher.
There will be a love offering at the opportunity for y'all to donate.
So my job here tonight is very easy. I'm supposed to get things started. And so right before we started tonight, JD and I walked over to the lake, and one of the things that he said to me was how surprised he was that this book has taken off in the way he has. So JD, why? Why do you think that the book has had this kind of success? And what do you think that it says about the current situation in the United States?
Well, first, thank you to Rod. Thank you for UNO and the American Conservative for hosting. And I think the simplest answer to your question for why it took off the way that it did is because it's just a beautifully written book by a very smart and charming young man. And I think, but just kidding. The thing about a book, is that when you publish it, as a friend once said to me, that the worst part about publishing a book is the calm before the calm, because very often it comes out and just nothing happens. There's no conversation, there's no interest. And that's sort of what I expected to happen with this particular book. And there were a few elements of timing that I think really helped me. So obviously the book came out in June, late June, at a time when Donald Trump had clinched the nomination. A lot of people were asking, who are these people who have voted to make Donald Trump the Republican nominee? And of course, 6 months later or so, 5 months later, they'd be asking, who are these people who voted to make Donald Trump the President of the United States? And so just they're in an obvious way, the book got wrapped up in this political moment, and it had a lot of people asking questions about the white working class of the country. So that's one answer to the question. A second answer is just I feel in some ways that I got pretty lucky, right? I mean, the book came out, and a lot of folks don't realize this looking back, but David Brooks wrote a column about the book the day that the book came out, and sales spiked a little bit, and I did a couple of TV and radio interviews, and I had a decent first week of sales, and I remember I just missed the New York Times bestseller list, and that was the first week. And then the second week, sales went a little bit down, and I was like, oh, that was pretty decent. I had this little flash in the pan moment, and then I did this interview with Rod at the American Conservative magazine, and he posted it online. And what was so weird about that interview is that I was actually in England, sort of recovering from my 2 weeks of book publicity. I took a little vacation with my wife, and I got on a plane from London to JFK. And when I turned my phone on, when I landed, I was still in that, the TSA line where you're not supposed to be checking your phone because you still haven't gone through customs. And like Jake Tapper and Mark Andreessen were tweeting that interview at me. And I thought, oh, that's weird. And then the book had sort of exploded. And, I went and checked my Amazon ranking, which is what, if you've ever written a book, you check your Amazon ranking obsessively because it's a way to check how many people were reading it in real time. And then it just sort of took off. And so it's a combination of luck, hitting a viral internet moment. The timeliness really helped me with the election of Trump. I am hopeful that there are some enduring lessons and some enduring arguments that are in the book that actually withstand the test of time. And really the fundamental thesis of the book is that upward mobility is not happening as much as we would like it to in the United States for really, really complicated reasons. That there are a lot of things that are making it hard for kids who come from backgrounds like I do to do especially well in life. And I don't think that message and that argument is timely in the sense that I think it's a problem that, if anything, will only get worse and certainly is going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Well, if I can add to that, when I was sent a copy by one of the readers of my blog at the American Conservative, I was sent an electronic copy of JD's book, and she said, you really need to read this. So I was headed to Boston for a thing I had to do for a week there last summer, and I read the whole thing on the plane, but from Baton Rouge to Boston, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I mean, to me, it felt a lot like the first time I read Flannery O'Connor when I was in high school, and I thought, finally, somebody's writing about the people I grew up with, the people I knew in St. Francisville, in rural Louisiana. And it's not the case that I saw quite the poverty and the brokenness that JD lived through, but we came close enough, and now it started to be a lot more of that to be where I'm from. And I read his book, and I said, I got to do an interview with this guy. So JD and I did this interview on email, and I posted it to my blog from my hotel room in Boston. And that week, I posted, I think, on a Friday. That weekend, the server at the American Conservative melted down 3 times. The last time I checked, we had 1.7 million views of that interview. And it was like a spike right into the vein of a lot of people in America. My email was overflowing with people who wanted me to forward this on to JD. They said, this is my story. I'm a PhD in astrophysics, but I was raised like this, and man, he's speaking to my experience. And so I think that we know now it's become sort of conventional wisdom that hillbilly elegy explains a lot of the Trump voters, and I think that really is true. But what we don't know, the conversation we're not having yet, maybe because we don't know how to have it, is, okay, so what do we do now? Because JD was outspoken in his opposition to Donald Trump, but he also had a lot of sympathy for the people who saw some sort of hope in Donald Trump. And my own views of Donald Trump were aligned with JD's. I found myself being more against people who hated Trump than against Trump himself. I didn't vote for Trump, but I feel like I understood something having read JD's book and having talked to people that I grew up with about why a lot of people felt so desperate that they would even cast their vote for Donald Trump. If I can ask you a question real quick.
Sure.
I heard you on Fresh Air right after the book came out, and you described Donald Trump as being like a political opiate, like the political version of the opioid crisis. Could you expand on that?
Yeah. Well, hopefully, now that he's president, no stray bullets are gonna, fly at me from stray corners of the room. But yeah, I mean, the framing and what I was trying to get at with that is that, I think the opioid crisis has set in areas where there is a lot of real struggle. These aren't largely made up problems. These are very real problems of unemployment and hopelessness and despair and family trauma and on and on and on. And I think that it's not surprising that in those areas where you have a lot of these social problems, you also have people turning, in some cases, to alcohol, in some cases to prescription drugs, in some cases to heroin, in some ways to try to sort of serve as a salve to some of these problems, to really address the pain that's caused when a lot of your community seems to be struggling. And what I saw in Trump, and I was always very conflicted by Trump, because on the one hand, I really appreciated the diagnostic elements of Trump, that he was clearly pointing at something, I think in some ways at failures of the Republican Party, in some ways of failures of just the political elites broadly speaking, and saying, look, you've made promises, and whether the promises haven't come true because forces have just conspired against the country and your policies and your ideas weren't enough to stem the tide, or whether you and your policies actually made the problem worse, you guys have made promises to the American people that haven't necessarily happened. They haven't materialized. People haven't gotten better. There hasn't been this perpetual increasing of material prosperity in the country. And so I thought that his criticism was in a lot of ways especially valid. But the problem is the prescriptive elements of Trump. In other words, the actual policies that he was proposing to make the problem better, I thought would either not make the problem better at all or might even make the problem worse. I just never saw, when I think of all of what's going on in my community, I see it as an incredibly complicated 20 or 30 factor problem that requires this really complex, thoughtful intervention from nonprofits and churches and communities and policymakers, and it just didn't strike me that Trump actually had the answers, that he wasn't dealing with these problems with the complexity that they required. And I still fear that, having, we're obviously early in the presidency, but I still really have that fear. And that's what I was trying to get at, is you have this thing that is coming from a very real place of struggle and pain, but is it going to make the problem better? No, it may even make the problem worse.
I think one reason your book took off, and this is one of the things that spoke to me about it, was that you talk about the structural problems in the economy that led to the brokenness and the despair among the white working class, but you also gave them agency.
Sure.
You blamed them for part of their own problem, and that resonated with me because I come from a family whose both of my parents were raised in rural poverty in West Feliciana. And my dad was the first one in his family to go to college. He went on the GI Bill in the 50s to LSU. And my dad who passed away a couple of years ago, my dad always talked about the value of work and education. And that was his religion. I mean, we were Methodists, we were Easter and Christmas Methodists, but mostly it was about hard work and education and personal responsibility. And I can remember thinking about, how my dad would point out to us, he always told us never look down on somebody below you, but he also said a man who won't work is no damn good. I mean, he was a countryman.
Mm-hmm.
That was his view. And now that he's lived long enough, he died a couple of years ago, and he could see what had happened to that ethic, that work ethic, how it had collapsed among a lot of working class people. And that's something that I think is part of the problem. This is kind of what my book talks about what has happened to our ethic, the same ethic that helped people who had nothing during the Depression, poor people, to hold on through this crisis. I think also about my friend Wendell Pierce from New Orleans here, the actor. I helped him work on his book, his memoir, The Wind in the Reeds. And it just blew me away to talk to him about what his family, who grew up, his family is from St. James Parish, and how they not only had to deal with all the poverty that my family had to deal with, but they also had to deal with the racism, the Jim Crow, the Klan. And yet, Wendell's uncle will tell you it was faith and hard work and education that brought them through. How do we even begin to get back to that?
Yeah, I've got a comment there, and I've got also a question, because I'm very curious. Well, I'll ask the question at the end, so you don't have to answer it right now. But so one of the things that really bothers me about the way that we talk about the problems of lower income Americans in the country is that we have this side of sort of either or framing. Like either the economy is unfair, either government policy is inadequate, or either there's a sort of failure of personal responsibility in one form or another. And I think that is just such a short-sighted and incomplete way to talk about the problems of lower income Americans, because it's not just people and governments and an economy, it's also communities and cultures, and there are all of these things, what Tocqueville would have called the mediating institutions, that are really important in the way that these problems replicate themselves. So, we can say and be very correct that a lot of families find themselves in the situation that my family is because they lost a job through no fault of their own, because the economic rug was pulled from under them through no fault of their own. But once these problems set in, once families are incredibly stressed and expose their children to a lot of trauma, once the family starts to break apart, we just aren't being honest with ourselves if we pretend that those things don't have later on follow-on negative effects that become completely independent of the economy, right? This is like the story of my life, that when you have family trauma, even when you're given opportunities, even when you're given some of the material prosperity that maybe didn't happen in your family, you don't necessarily just snap out of every negative lesson that you learned growing up in an emotionally and physically abusive household. That's just not how it works. And whether we want to admit it or not, the simple fact is that lower income Americans have much higher rates of family trauma, of what psychologists call adverse childhood experiences, than upper income folks do. So we can either pretend that that's not happening and pretend that it's not having an effect on the way that these kids grow up in these households, or we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, yeah, this is happening. What do we do about it? And I don't think, it always bothers me, especially when this comes from folks on the right, and of course, you and I are conservatives, but we tend to frame these problems in sometimes morally condemnatory ways, right? And it's not, like, when you think of the way that I grew up and some of the ways that I interacted with my wife when we first started dating, that wasn't really my fault in a morally judgmental way. I was doing the same things that people had done in my family going back generations, and I was just replaying and reliving the same things that I had learned. I don't think of that as I'm some morally reprehensible person, but I also think that I benefited from this idea that, look, JD, you eventually have to cut the link from the past, from the family that you grew up in, from all of the negative experiences, and take some responsibility and not continue to mistreat the person who's closest to you. Like that conversation, that internal monologue just has to happen for a lot of people who grow up in these families. And the way that I would frame this is, I was in Portsmouth, Ohio a couple of weeks ago, and for those of you who know the opioid crisis, Portsmouth, Ohio has sort of been ground zero. It's where Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio meet, and it has been absolutely ravaged by this stuff. And I was talking to a couple of very progressive, one a licensed youth counselor, and one, this guy's he's a family court judge. And I was talking to these guys, and they would go from extraordinarily angrily talking about why don't these addicts shape up and stop treating their kids like this. That would be 1 minute, and then 2 minutes later, they would start saying, I can't take these people who are so judgmental to these addicts, who treat addicts like addiction like it has nothing to do with biology. You know, we have to appreciate that these people are really struggling with some sort of disease. And that's how real people who are confronted with these problems actually look at them. They realize they're complex. They go from being a little bit judgmental to a little bit sympathetic. And I think that if you grow up in these communities, it's impossible not to sort of oscillate between the two, because that's how people actually are. They're complicated. Now, the question that I have for you is, you know, your dad died a couple years ago. What do you think he would have thought of Donald Trump?
Oh, I can tell you what he thought of Donald Trump. My dad was on home hospice care, and my wife and I don't have a TV, and so we had not seen Donald Trump on TV. This was during 2015, but we had lived in New York in the 90s and the early 2000s, and so we knew that Trump was widely considered to be a buffoon in New York. So we went over to visit my dad. This was about 10 days before he died, and he was in his hospital bed in his bedroom, and you know, I bought him a small TV to have at the foot of his bed as he was for his last days, because as we know, you know, nobody should go through their last days on this earth without seeing Bill O'Reilly. And, seriously, he wanted it for O'Reilly. And we were over there. My wife and I were visiting my folks, and he was watching O'Reilly, and O'Reilly cut away to Trump's Mobile, Alabama rally, and my dad wanted to watch it. And Julie, my wife, and I said, oh, this is going to be good. And so Trump comes out there and he says, hello, Mobile. He said, this crowd reminds me of a Billy Graham rally. Let's hear it for Billy Graham. Julie and I looked at each other like, oh, come on, really? And so Trump starts in talking about immigrants this and his usual shtick. And, you know, Julie and I are being so, you know, la-di-da, like exchanging glances back and forth. My mother says, you know, he makes a lot of sense. My dad said, uh-huh. And I realized I'm living in St. Francisville around my own family, but boy, am I in a bubble. You know, just because of where I get my news, from online and from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And I had to really try to understand what it was about Trump that impressed even, you know, good country people like my folks. And I remember my mom, we were talking about this on the way here, when Trump's, the big tape came out, the Billy Bush tape came out, I called her that weekend and said, oh, your boy Trump, look what he said now about women. You still gonna vote for him? Yeah. No, come on, Mama, really? I mean, what if he'd said that about your granddaughter? She's still gonna vote for him because he wasn't Hillary Clinton. And she thought that Trump, this billionaire from New York, was on her side. She identified more with him than with Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton was uppity. And that was pretty much all it took. And that helped me understand that, you know, identity politics, a lot of people on the right think that identity politics is something that's only played on the left. But oh no, this is America right now.
Yep.
And I think a lot of us, I think this is an American problem. We are so deep inside our own bubbles that we don't want to hear what the other side is saying, and we don't even want to hear any facts that contradict the narrative that we've chosen.
Yeah, it reminds me of this conversation that a lot of folks were having, especially in sort of the mainstream media, about what was really driving attraction to Donald Trump. Was it economic anxiety or was it racial anxiety, right? And the thing that always annoyed me about that conversation is that it's like, do you think that human beings are motivated by economic anxiety and racism, and those are the two buckets? You know, people are complicated. People are voting for Donald Trump for all kinds of different reasons. Some of them simply because they think that Hillary Clinton is on one side of a divide and I'm on the other side of a divide, right? And it always sort of bothered me that conversation, because it framed people as having fundamentally two motivations, right? Either they're voting for Trump because they're economically dispossessed, or they're voting for Trump because they're racist. And it struck me that most people are voting for the candidate that they're voting for 100 different reasons. Half of them they're not even consciously aware of.
Right. You saying that reminds me of something my mom told me once. She had a friend of hers sitting on her front porch. I wrote about this in my book. friend sat on her front porch last year and said, you know, I've been to 6 baby showers this year, and all for nieces in my family. None of them married. Some of them haven't. This is their 3rd or 4th child by different men, never been married. She said, how did things get like this? One generation this happened. This is working class South Louisiana white people. It all fell apart in one generation for them, and she was just blindsided by it. I think there's a lot of that kind of anxiety, that people see the world falling apart, the world that they knew. And, you know, my people, you know, they got good jobs in Louisiana plants, paper mills, things like that. Well, those jobs are starting to go away. And the agricultural economy where I'm from, it collapsed in the 70s and the 80s. So people don't have that sense of security that they used to. And I think that out of that anxiety, they're reaching out in anger and fear. And I think it's a very human thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that it makes me think that I guess seeing this from the other side has made me think a little bit about the way that those of us on the right very often talk about sort of what's really motivating Democratic voters, right? And that conversation, you know, very often occurred in the context, and this is sort of a random aside, but very often occurred in the context of why aren't Black Americans voting for Republicans, right? And I'm sure you probably saw this a fair amount. I certainly saw this in sort of the political circles that I ran in. And there were basically 2 minds, or 2 approaches to this question. The more sophisticated, and I think the correct answer to that question was, they're not voting for us because they don't get anything from us. We're not promising anything. We're not speaking to their concerns. We're not actually trying to address what would make or we're not addressing the concerns that would motivate a human being to vote for a political party. And then the sort of crass and I think wrong approach to that question was, well, minorities are addicted to the Democratic plantation in one form or another. And you hear that language sometimes in sort of mainstream press, but you especially hear it, I think, on darker corners of the internet, right? So the reason that primarily Black Americans, but it would apply to other groups too, the reason they're not voting for Republicans is fundamentally because they're somehow sort of confused or tricked by Democrats into voting against their economic interests. But there's such an analog. I mean, that conversation that Republicans had, and I heard Republicans have, that effectively people are being tricked into voting against their own interests, that people have right now about Trump voters.
What's the matter with Kansas?
Exactly. And what was so interesting to me about the Trump phenomenon is it made me realize that same conversation was happening on the left that had been happening on the right. And it's in some ways, I think, it's dominated on both sides by people who I think are wrong. Because I think that the primary left answer to why people are voting for Donald Trump is wrong. And I think the primary right answer for why Black Americans aren't voting for Republicans is also wrong.
You know, one thing that I think that one reason people ought to read your book is that a lot of middle class people and upper middle class people may read that and think, oh, those poor people, their lives are so messed up, drugs, blah, 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 poverty. But I think a lot of middle class people don't have any real idea about how fragile their own and our own lives are. I was talking to a doctor friend of mine last year who was telling me that in his small town, he sees more and more middle class and upper middle class young people who are coming in there failing to thrive. He said, I was talking to him, and he said, just today in my office, I had a 19-year-old from a really good family, a family that has all the resources in the world. He's not in school. He had a 32 in his ACT test. He doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. His parents are blaming everybody else, but not themselves. Mm-hmm. You know, and he said, I'm seeing this happen more and more. It was almost like listening to a Walker Percy. It's one of Walker Percy's doctors, you know, seeing that something crazy in the water is going on.
Yeah.
And I guess that I think that there's a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose, a loss of direction that seems to be ubiquitous. The working classes of all races are having it first, but I fear that disease is going to come to everybody, and a lot of middle class people think it's not going to happen to them.
Yeah, I share the same concern, and the way I often frame this, because very often I talk to middle class and upper middle class audiences, and I'm trying to convince them that the problems that I'm writing about are not just narrowly related to working class and poor Americans, is that there are all these ways to measure the American dream. There are different ways that economists and sociologists and political scientists have tried to measure it. But the typical, and I think in some ways the best, though it's imperfect metric to use, is what are the odds that a kid who's born today will live a better life than the life that his parents lived? So what are the odds that your children are going to have materially improved circumstances relative to you? In the 1940s, that number was 90%. 90% of parents could expect their kids to live a better life than themselves. In the 1980s, that number was 50%. And you can almost certainly expect that that number today is even smaller. Now, we don't know yet because the kids who were born in the 1990s aren't, quite earning full income, but the expectation is that trend line has been moving in the wrong direction. So yeah, it's not just working class Americans who are facing this problem. It is a problem of the broad American middle, and it keeps on percolating up in a way that should worry, I think, everybody. And this question of meaning is really important to me, and I don't know that I have a fantastic answer to it. But one of the things I wrote about in the book is that you have really high rates of religious identification among the working class, but you increasingly have really low rates of church participation among the working class. And so you have this sort of weird, secularized, identity-based religion that doesn't necessarily translate into actual church practice. And I think that can lead to a weird crisis of meaning, right? If your faith is something that maybe is like a cultural badge of honor, something that you wear that helps identify you, but isn't necessarily providing you with community, isn't necessarily providing you with sort of day-to-day rituals, that's of course something you write about quite a bit in the Benedict option.
Yeah, in fact, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, one of the things that you've been talking about is, well, they've cut my mind perhaps. One of the things you've been talking about is diagnosing some of the problems, and you spent a lot of time you talking about that, but what about a path forward? Where do you think we're headed? Because I like to be sort of hopeful and cheery, and this is...
Oh, you've come to the wrong place.
I'm sort of sitting here and just like, man, this is kind of depressing. No. Where do we go if you're either a conservative or a Christian or even a friend on the left? Because again, you're talking to people that are a bubble. Many of us are affiliated with the university, and it's a different type of bubble we're working with there. So what's the path forward? Do you see something hopeful? And if so, what is it, and how do we get there?
Silence.
Oh.
I wrote my book, The Benedict Option, as a Christian for other Christians. And the thesis of the book, if you haven't read or heard about it, the thesis is that we are living in a time now in the West. It's not about global Christianity, it's the West, that is comparable to the breakdown of the Roman Empire in the West in the 6th century. 5th and 6th centuries. That's not just me saying that. I quote Pope Benedict XVI said the same thing. He said that the spiritual crisis in the West now is worse than any since the fall of the Roman Empire. But mostly I rely on the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who made this observation back in 1981 when he was still a Marxist. He later became a Thomist without leaving all his Marxism behind. But he makes a really good point in his book After Virtue, which is one of the landmark books in philosophy. He said that we in the West, when we had the Enlightenment, we severed our ties to the past, to religion, to inherited customs and so forth, and we hoped that we could, this is very crude, but he said he hoped that we could use reason alone to provide a common ethic to bind us together. In fact, that has failed. And MacIntyre said we are at a point now where people don't really reason together. Everything is all about emotions, emotivism he called. And it's impossible, he called it, it's impossible to have an argument, a productive argument to settle our differences when people don't really use reason, except they instrumentalize reason to justify what they feel in their hearts. MacIntyre compared that, he ended the book by saying that we are a lot like the fall of Rome. Society is falling apart, coming apart, and what we await now is a new and doubtless very different Saint Benedict. What he meant by that is we need somebody to be like Benedict of Nursia, the founder of the Benedictine monasticism, who walked out of the city of Rome, ruled by the barbarians, and founded a religious order, the Benedictines. He actually literally founded 13 monasteries before he died and wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict. What he accomplished without knowing what he was doing was to lay the seeds for the rebirth of civilization in Western Europe, because over the next 200 or 300 years, those monks, young men flocked to the monasteries, They spread throughout barbarian Western Europe. They evangelized people. They taught them to pray. They taught them how to garden. They taught them the arts of life, so many of which had been lost when Rome collapsed. And they taught literacy to the upper class people, and they laid the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization. What McIntyre calls on is Christian. Well, he doesn't call explicitly on Christians. He's not addressing Christians, but taking his argument, what I call on people of faith, Christians, to do is to learn from the Benedictines, to thicken our communities of faith, our churches, our religious schools, our families, to burrow down more deeply into our tradition and into Scripture, not so we can hide in the hills and just wait for the apocalypse, but so that we can be present in the world today as faithful witnesses to the gospel. And that can take all kinds of manifestations. But I really think that's the only hope. And Benedict, crucially, did not go out to the woods thinking, I'm going to make the empire great again. All he wanted to do, really, all he wanted to do was to figure out, how can I serve God in community most faithfully in the conditions in which I find myself? And every good thing that came out of what the Benedictines did started first with him putting God first and living in an ascetic, self-sacrificial way. I don't see any other way forward for us in this particular culture. And I have a really strong critique in my book of the contemporary church and contemporary Christians as being people who are more interested in religion for therapeutic value. The prosperity gospel is especially bad about this, but it's true in all our churches. This thing called moralistic therapeutic deism, a mouthful there, but a Notre Dame professor, sociologist Christian Smith, did studies of American Christianity, and he said this is the de facto religion of America. It is not the Christianity of the Bible, but rather it's a Christianity that thinks God is there to make me happy. He expects me to be happy, and anything I do in my life that makes me happy is okay by him. That is what Smith said is a de facto religion in America. He has the research to back it up. And everything I've seen, or most everything I've seen from general American Christianity, says that Smith has it right. But that's not a faith that's going to be able to last through hard times.
You were supposed to say something optimistic,
Oh,
Ron.
no. No, I'm hopeful but not optimistic. I think there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that everything's going to be fine, it's all going to work out. I don't think that's necessarily true. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I am hopeful. And for a Christian, hope is the belief that no matter how bad things may get, that God is working there, and God will reward the people who are faithful. You know, even if we're called to some kind of martyrdom, that's the worst case scenario. I don't think that's coming. It may, who knows? But you know, even if we're called to some kind of martyrdom, that is still something good. And it's not, you can't sell many books on that necessarily, and you sure can't sell a campaign. But I believe it's the truth, and that we have lost a sense of asceticism, which has always been key to Christianity. The sense of being able to sacrifice and suffer in joy for our faith. I think that a lot of that has slipped away from us in our middle class comfort.
Yeah, well, one of the things about Rod's book, or in my view, the most persuasive and most compelling element of Rod's book is where he does criticize the contemporary church as sort of too short-sighted, I think inadequate to the challenges that it's really facing. And I think that's a totally fair criticism. Rod and I were actually talking about this a little bit on the car ride from the airport. And I don't know, I'm certainly much more optimistic, I think, about the future of the West than I think Rod is. I don't know if that's a real optimism or if that's just because I'm sort of one of these guys who always sees the glass as half full. And I've thought a lot about this in my mind, that I'm sort of, I'm one of these people who's pulled between a declinist narrative, a fear that things are sort of always getting worse, and a recognition that there are certain things that are certainly better now than they were 50 years ago, certainly things that are better now than they were 200, 300 years ago. I don't think Rod would disagree with that, but I do think that there's a weird way in which both the declinist narrative and the optimistic narrative have something to offer. So my optimistic take on the future and this is not an explicitly religious message, though I do think that the church is going to have to play a really important part of this, is that it's really useful to recognize the scale of a challenge, right? And I think that we're all in this period where we're sort of waking up to the fact that a lot of things aren't necessarily working. A lot of people aren't doing especially well. A lot of communities are feeling left behind, and in fact are left behind. And that recognition can be incredibly powerful. You can't solve a problem unless you recognize that it's there. And so I think the fact that we're finally talking about the fact that we have an upward mobility crisis in the United States, that we have a real problem of declining community institutions in the country, I think that's a really good conversation to have. Now, on the policy front, anybody who's read my book knows that I think that there are policy helpers, but there are true policy solutions, meaning there isn't a magic flip that I think the government can switch to make these things better. But there are a couple of things that would definitely help, right? I think that we have to get better at preparing people, and this is sort of a radical departure from Rod's concerns, but we have to do a much better job of preparing people for the modern workforce. Our universities, by and large, have not been especially effective at that. Kids get a lot of debt. They get a lot of education. They're not necessarily super well prepared for the jobs that exist in the 21st century. That's a real problem. I think we have a massive problem, and something that's not talked about enough, in American housing policy, where we effectively encourage poor people to cut themselves off from middle income and upper middle income people, to cloister into really concentrated communities of poverty and despair and hopelessness. I think that is in part a consequence of really bad housing policy at the state and federal level. If you start to correct some of those things, then I think you can start to deal with some of the real community-based issues that I talk about in my book, and I do think those are a real root of some of the significant issues. So I see things that we can do to make this problem better. But I also think, to bring this all back and to sound, a partial note of cynicism, I worry a little bit that we have a cultural problem among sort of my generation, right? So millennials, those born between, let's say, 80 and 2000, or whatever the marker for the millennial generation is. Because, when I talk to people about these problems, and I talk about my book, I'm very often confronted with the question, okay, what do we do? And very often it's asked by a 22 or 24-year-old person who really is looking for a particular type of solution. And that type of solution is typically a federal law change. What is the bill that we can pass that can help all of the people in your book? And look, I think that there are policies that the federal government could pass and the state government could pass that would make things better. But at a fundamental level, I worry that millennials have again, this is a gross generalization, it's not true for everybody, but very often focus on how they can make life better for 3 million people or 30 million people. And there's not enough thought that's focused on how can I make life a lot better for 1 or 2 or 3 people. We don't talk as much about how we can make a really big difference at the community level or at the family level. And I worry that's a sort of weird malady of the millennial generation, that when we ask about solutions, we shouldn't just be thinking of a federal policy intervention. We should be thinking about, what is something you could do at the level of your family and your community to go into areas that really need it and to actually help them.
That is one helpful way for me to think about politics, because I quit being a Republican in 2008. I just got fed up with the Republican Party and the Bush administration. I didn't cease to be a conservative, and I sure wasn't going to be a Democrat, and I've generally voted conservative since then. I voted for some Democrats, but I don't feel that either party represents me in Washington. I felt that way before Donald Trump, and certainly feel that way now. But it has made me discouraged about conventional politics. But as I was doing research for my book, The Benedict Option, I came across a politics that was practiced in, of all places, communist Czechoslovakia. And there was Václav Havel, the great, he became the Czech president after the fall of communism, but before then, under communism, he was a playwright and a dissident, the leading dissident in the country. He and his circle knew that they were powerless politically in terms of actual, the governing of the state in terms of conventional politics. But they did not believe that they therefore had the right to just check out and be quiet and everything. There was this one particular dissident, part of that circle, who was the only Christian, a Catholic named Václav Benda, a mathematician. And he believed fervently that it was the wrong thing to do for Catholics to stand back and just not get involved. He believed in practicing what he called a parallel polis, building institutions locally that could serve the people and for people to live out their faith in the only way they could under communism, but they had to do something. And he said just coming together and being with each other reverse the fragmentation and the atomization that the communist system depended on for its power. Reading Václav Benda from the position of the bowling alone America, I see that how we don't need the government to separate us. We do that ourselves with our smartphones and our computers and our TVs. We don't come out and come together much. There was a story when Hurricane Gustav came through Louisiana about 10 years ago. It knocked out power in West Feliciana for about 14 days, which in August is a long time. If you don't, thank you. And my sister I was living in Dallas, and my sister was living in St. Francisville, and she said at the end of that, she said, I was really kind of sorry the lights came back on. I said, wait, what, really? She said, yeah, because every night nobody had power. Everybody had to cook what was in their freezers and going bad. So everybody in the neighborhood would get together, they'd light a fire on somebody's grill, and would cook meat, tell stories. Somebody would have gone to Mississippi to get ice and beer and Coke, and she said it was really great for us all to get to know each other. Power comes back on, everybody goes back to their houses and resumes the fragmented, atomized existence. Well, Václav Benda, under communism in the 60s and 70s and 80s, said we can't live that way. We have got to get out of our houses and come together and just be together. That is a form of politics. If politics is about how we live together and work for the common good, then even if the Republicans or the Democrats don't have anything to say to you, or you don't feel like that they represent you, that's no reason why you can't get involved locally, even if it's only in your church or a civic club or your school, something like that. But you can't just sit there. But getting involved locally, that is doing politics, I think.
Yeah, I think it is too. And one of the biggest predictors of the decline of social mobility in the areas where it's really low, one of the biggest drivers is declining social capital, which I'm sure most of you know what social capital is, but it's this basic idea that those sorts of relationships, those sorts of organizations have information benefits, they have social support benefits, that in other words, the relationships that we build in our community actually have real tangible value beyond just it's nice to hang out with people. And of course it is nice to hang out with people, but I do think that we've lost something. We've lost something about the community, about the village that really makes our country tick. And this is of course what Tocqueville saw as really unique about the United States when he came and did his big visit, is that these people aren't just engaged at the level of government, and they're not just engaged at the level of their families, they're actually really engaged in the life of a community. And I worry that we have lost that.
Yeah, we were talking about this on the way over here, that I think, correct me if I'm quoting you wrong, but you said that we really suffer in our culture today from a deficit of meaning. We don't know how to produce meaning. I recently finished a new book out called Homo Deus by a historian called Yuval Noah Harari. And it's a really, he's a techno-optimist. He believes that science and technology is going to fix everything that's wrong with us. But I find it a pretty dystopian book, because he thinks that there's no such thing as a soul, that humans are just algorithms, and if we get the scientists to fiddle with our genes right, then we'll be at a place where we can experience constant pleasure. He thinks Brave New World literally is a utopia, not a dystopia. But there's a lot of wisdom in the book, even though I strongly disagree with his conclusions. He says that the contract of modernity is simple. He said, we trade in meaning, give up meaning in exchange for power. And again, he thinks this is good. He believes, and I think he's probably right about this, that in modernity, we sever our ties to the past and to the idea that there is a God who expects us, that thou shalt not do these things, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not. We've gotten rid of that, and we've freed ourselves up to fulfill our own desires. Well, what happens when the social capital that we had built up for centuries and centuries of Christian faith and Greco-Roman philosophy, what happens when that runs out? We're going to find that out right now. And I don't know what we replace it with.
Yeah, the way that I worry about this is in the context of terrorism, especially terrorism, these sort of homegrown terrorists in Europe, right? And I think, unfortunately, you can start to make an early comparison between what you see with homegrown terrorists in Europe and what you see sort of now. Do I think the alt-right is going to turn into a terrorist movement? No, but I think that the way that it recruits people who are really searching for meaning is actually pretty similar. And what I mean by this is, I look at a country like the United Kingdom, which is rife with economic opportunities. It's one of the wealthiest societies in the world, and yet they have a real problem, not with first-generation immigrants, but with the children of those immigrants, the children who grew up in the comforts of the United Kingdom, getting online and turning to some form of radicalization. And it just makes me think, what is it about Western society at this moment in time that can raise someone in incredible comforts that their parents quite literally could only have dreamed of until they immigrated, and raise them and leave them with such a deficit of meaning that they find it in an ISIS message board online? Or what is it about our sort of, I think, again, the analogy that I would make here in the United States is you have a lot of kids who get caught up in the so-called alt-right who are, live relatively stable middle-class lives. These are not the children that I grew up around. These are kids who live pretty successful lives, and you've written about this a little bit, that they seem to get caught up in this sort of tribalism, this identitarianism. And it just makes me worried that we're not super good in our society right now at giving kind of existential meaning to people.
You make me recall a reader of my blog, a high school kid. He's a senior at a conservative Christian high school, who wrote me and said that he's hearing the other boys in his class talk about in alt-right terms and talk about white nationalism and all that. He said these kids are privileged. I said, and I wrote back to him and I said, well, don't they go to church? He goes, yeah. I said, they're not hearing this in church, are they? He said, no, but they're not hearing anything from church except Jesus is your friend. Jesus wants to be your best friend. And I don't know the details there, but this really troubled him a lot, because these are kids who, by his description, are privileged kids. I think also about Dylan Roof, the guy who shot and killed the African-American churchgoers. A writer for the Washington Post did a fascinating, just gut-wrenching story about Dylan Roof, where he came from. And it was something straight out of your book, frankly. A rootless kid, father abandoned the family. He was just piling together with other kids, playing video games all day, smoking pot, whatever. He found some sense of meaning in racism and hatred, and that drove him. It made me think, reading that, I thought, my God, if all these disaffected young men somebody figures out a way to organize them, and they ever put down the video game thing and quit smoking dope and form part of some sort of far right wing political movement, it could be pretty scary. I mean, this is the lumpen proletariat. This is the masses where anger, that anger and sense of displacement and rage, it has to go somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that this is where we should really be asking ourselves these sort of difficult questions about community. And frankly, I think Christians should be asking ourselves really difficult questions about why is it that a privileged middle-class white kid who goes to church isn't finding enough at church that he's sort of attracted to these other things. And that really does trouble me. And I think that when I think of what is really going on in the lives of sort of the Christian church and the Christian community right now, I was telling you this in the car, but I'll tell all of you. I was talking to a kid from back home who is really struggling. A lot of really, really rough stuff going on in his background. I don't want to get into it because I don't want to betray his trust or anything. But we were talking a little bit about God, and he said, I still believe in God. I'm not an atheist or anything. This is a high school senior. But he said, God just isn't relevant in my life anymore. He said, my grandma told me that God loves me and will fix everything, but he's not fixing everything. And it occurred to me that this sort of search for meaning sometimes finds itself when people are promised things about their religious faith that don't actually end up matching with reality, right? If you're told that God means X and X just isn't there, it isn't present in your life, if the church that you were brought up in starts to lose its relevance, then I think it does lead to a crisis of faith among a lot of people. And that was in some ways the crisis of my faith when I was late teens and early 20s, when I would have called myself an atheist and I was reading Sam Harris books and Richard Dawkins books and the like, is that the Christian faith just wasn't relevant to the real struggle that was going on in my communities. Jesus loves you and wants you to be happy. Pray, I don't mean to hate on Joel Osteen. He seems like a nice enough guy, but Joel Osteen, when you're seeing opioid addiction ravage your community, people putting guns in their mouths and pulling the trigger, children in really broken families, and somebody's telling you that God really wants you to be happy and he just wants you to pray really hard and you'll be rewarded with financial gain, it's just completely divorced from the real struggle that exists in a lot of these communities.
You asked for optimism.
This is getting worse and worse.
But can I tell you though, that this is, I wish that I were more optimistic about things. Maybe part of it is being from Louisiana and learning never to expect much from the government, right? But and I try to explain this to people when they meet me, when I travel out of the state, and they say, oh wow, you're a lot happier and a lot nicer guy than I thought from your blog. And I say, well, maybe it's a Louisiana thing, because when the hurricane is coming, we batten things down, but then we get out the gumbo pot and we start making gumbo and we ice down the beer and invite all our friends over and ride out the storm, feasting and being together. And it sounds almost cheesy and sentimental, but I think there really is something to that. But I think that maybe there's some hope there. Maybe I should have written a book about the Ignatius Riley option.
Well, and I think one of the things that I'm thinking of, and I know JD's in this position too, is I've got a very young child, another one on the way, and JD's got a young child too coming, and we're now in charge of directing, in some ways, this child's life. Right? They're now growing up in this world. As someone who has in that type of position, right, what should someone be doing? And not just that, but in many ways, I'm also an educator. I'm dealing with a lot of these students. Dealing with is the wrong word. I'm working with a lot of these students.
This is being recorded too. We'll have to edit that one out. We're working with a lot of students who especially at a university like the University of New Orleans, these are working class individuals who want to make their lives better. As I was telling JD out by the lake, can't tell you how many students have come to me to say, I just want to be someone. These are our students here. So what do we do? Someone in that position, what advice do you have? Because I imagine all of us in one way or another are in that position, whether it's our families, our communities, or we're educators. Please, some optimism.
Okay, I'll try this one. And this is real optimism here. I actually really believe this. And what do we do, I think, is that we try to find ways to be really involved in a community, however you define it. If you're a religious person, some sort of church, synagogue, whatever. If you're not a religious person, Narcotics Anonymous or a community organization or working with underprivileged kids. I think that there's just something incredibly meaningful and value-adding to being part of not just the narrow castle in which you find yourself, but actually going and being involved in the community. And I think that is just something that we really have to get back to, and I think we're recognizing that there's real virtue in it. I mean, you do see this broad recognition, especially among the elites, but I think that these sorts of things tend to trickle down, that there's something missing in a life that's completely divorced from the broader American community, whatever that community is, again, whatever level it is, whatever type it is. I just think that there's something incredibly valuable to being part of, it sounds trite, something bigger than yourself, but being part of your neighborhood, being part of the city or town in which you find yourself. And so, my kid is coming in 7 weeks, and I think that one of the things that I'm gonna really be mindful of is that one of the things I lacked when I was a kid that I really didn't like is a sense that I belonged to something that was bigger, that it wasn't just my family against the world, that it was my family plus other people around us against something else. And I hope to replicate that in a number of different ways in the life of my kid. And that's already, I think, one of the really good things about my life right now is that I'm involved in a number of different things, not just a dysfunctional family.
Well, in our case, it's our family against the Crimson Tide. That's it's a sacred cause. No, I think that I get real hope from my sisters, the story of my sister Ruthie Lemming. I wrote a book called The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming a few years ago about my younger sister who died of cancer. And she and I were both raised in St. Francisville. I got out as fast as I could, went to LSU, then went to the East Coast to be a journalist. She came home, married her high school sweetheart, and taught school in the local elementary school, local public school, and started her family there. And I was happy for her. She wanted to be a small town girl, and I wanted to be a big city boy. When she was struck by terminal cancer at the age of 40, got a diagnosis, and she died at 42. It was a shocking thing, of course, but I was living in Philadelphia at the time. I was able to rethink about life in my small town and in my sister's life. I saw it in completely different eyes. I saw this town come together to support my sister and her husband and kids and my parents through this terrible crisis. And when she died, I learned from so many people there about what a difference my sister had made in their lives as a teacher. I heard things about her that she would never have said about herself because she was pretty humble, and she was not any sort of, holy roller or anything. She was faithful to her church, but she was just a good small town school teacher. But the difference she made in people's lives, I heard stories that just reduced me to tears about poor kids who came from very broken families who said, because she encouraged me and she helped me, I've done something with my life. And to me, it made me think that here's what can happen in a very small life in a very small place. She only lived 42 years, but she lived an incredibly full life and satisfying life serving in this little out-of-the-way place. And I called the book The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming because it made me think of Saint Therese of Lisieux, who had her little way, her petite voix. She died at 24 of, I think, tuberculosis. But in the short time she lived, she wrote things that were so spiritually deep that the Catholic Church eventually declared that she is a doctor of the church. And I think that when we satisfy ourselves with being happy where we are, we don't have to go to Los Angeles or Washington or New York to make it big in the world and make a different trademark in the world. We can make a big difference right where we are if we learn to be satisfied. And that's one of the most difficult things, I think, today is learning to be satisfied with what you have.
Yeah, and to just add something to that, if you just look at demographic and movement trends, you see people almost evacuating Silicon Valley, New York, DC, returning to some of the communities that they came from. I do think that there is a broad recognition, not just that we have a problem with folks being left behind, but for those who have the ability to choose where they live, that there is something really valuable in going and finding that community wherever and however it exists. And so I again, not to be a cynic, because I really am optimistic here, because I think that people are recognizing that maybe we've lost a little bit of something in being too obsessed with the prestige or the really great credential or getting the next shiny jewel in our professional crown. And maybe there's something really valuable about finding a home and planting yourself in it and making a difference in it.
Well, I can say that back in the 80s when I was in LSU, the state was going through one of its perennial crises. Governor Edwards said it was the gubernatorial debate in 1987. We hosted one of them on LSU's campus, and somebody asked the candidates, how would you stop the best and the brightest from leaving the state, this exodus from the state of the talented students? And Edwin Edwards said, well, they can leave if they want to, goodbye to them. And I remember thinking, oh, that guy, he doesn't care, and maybe he didn't care. But around that same time, there was I was in journalism school at LSU, and there was a story about a reporter at either WWL or the Picayune here in New Orleans who stood up and announced that he was resigning and moving away. And he said, this got reported, and it came to our newsroom. He said that he did not want to raise his kids in a city that valued parades more than libraries. And I remember that really resonated with me, and I understood why he would leave. Well, 20, 30 years later, here I am, in my mid-40s, watching my sister die down in Louisiana, and I thought about the value of parades, because they went to parades, Mardi Gras parades, she and her family, and these little rituals, that and LSU football and the crawfish boil and just the little small rituals of daily life in South Louisiana, that was her life, and they gave her so much resilience and so much hope, and not only her, but her whole community. And it made me reevaluate the value of parades, using that as a metaphor for just what was Burke's phrase, was the unbought grace of life. That's one of the reasons I moved back to Louisiana from the East Coast, is not because this place is ever going to get its act together politically or economically. We hope so, but man, there's so much good here that is hard to quantify and hard to explain to somebody who's not from here.
Well, and you're not the only one who moved back. I mean, JD, you've moved back to Ohio. Why? I mean, why did you head back? I mean,
It's not for the food in your
No.
case, I know that.
It's definitely not for the food, though we do have Skyline Chili in Ohio, which is pretty solid. But I hear some groans in the audience there. Well, part of it is that look, we're having a baby soon, and I think when you're in that stage in your life, you just start thinking a little bit about where you want to put down roots and where you want to settle. But a big part of it is that I felt a responsibility to try to do something now that the book has been successful and I have this public platform, and I really care about the opioid crisis for personal reasons. It's something that afflicted my family very, very seriously and very personally. But I also just think that it's the sort of thing that if we don't figure out how to deal with it, it could take the entire country by storm. I mean, this stuff is not like alcohol. It's not like other drugs that we've done in the past. It's the sort of thing that really takes over people's brains, and that worries me. And so I wanted to work on that problem a little bit, and moving back home gave me a good opportunity to do it. But the very simple fact is that I moved back home because it's home, and because I loved it, and because I wanted to be closer to family, and because my wife, a San Diego girl, was either loyal enough or dumb enough to go with me when I said, honey, I want to move back to Ohio.
Well, I think that's important. I mean, even talking about the importance of community and how people are trying to find communities. And you mentioned before this discussion of the folks who are joining the alt-right or participating in those conversations. It's very possible that those people are also desperately looking for communities too. And if they were provided with other options, be it things that are constructive at a church or sports teams, or I played a lot of sports, or something along those lines, that's really what they're looking for. And the options just aren't there, but maybe that's me perhaps being a little bit too optimistic again. We've got a couple of minutes, and so I think it would be great to open up for at least a couple of questions if any of you have questions. You'll just have to speak up loudly, and then what we can do is we can repeat the question and then perhaps answer it. Does anyone have, let me take 2 or 3 if anyone's interested. Yes, sir. One and then, yes.
I'm an avid reader of the blog, Rod, so thank you, and I look forward to reading your book, JD. But can you guys talk about, you've talked about this focus on looking smaller, and that politics isn't just national. Can you talk about the ways big businesses or large business, large industry is not helpful in these problems in ways that you've talked about how people on the right are kind of defend big business no matter what, but maybe they shouldn't.
So the question's about big business and how big business is either harmful or perhaps not doing the best when it comes to political involvement.
Do you want to start with that?
Sure.
You're the finance.
Well, I guess a couple of thoughts that come to mind, and one, Burke was very famously really into the idea of labor unions, and not because he was a sort of sophisticated modern econometric thinker and he thought that labor unions were great for business, but because he recognized that labor unions actually could provide that sense of community, could be a community anchor in a way I think that we often miss when we talk about labor and business in purely economic terms, that it's not just about those things. So I have no strong views on whether, I mean, I think some big businesses probably are not very fantastic community anchors, and some actually are. So I don't have sort of sophisticated view that would allow me to pontificate in a really in a really categorical way on that issue. But I do think that the businesses that have really stood the test of time, if you look at the big Fortune 500 companies, they're very often businesses that actually played a really positive role in the communities that they came from, right? I mean, Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati is one classic example of a business that has really done very well for itself where others have failed, but it's done well for itself in part because it's not just an economic engine in Cincinnati, it really is one of the big drivers of the local community, the local economy, but also the local culture. And so I worry that we very often talk about the market on the right as this sort of completely morally neutral thing, or not even morally neutral, but always morally positive, when at the end of the day, like what's good for communities and what's good for businesses doesn't necessarily overlap. That doesn't mean we should be anti-business, but that means we should recognize, for example, that just because something's good for business, it's not necessarily good for the communities. The explicit example I'll give of that is that, you know, there's a very famous paper by David Autor where he looked at exposure to Chinese trade and how it affected the various social indicators in a lot of these communities. And unsurprisingly, you saw spiking mortality rates, rising addiction, rising family breakdown in the areas that were most exposed to Chinese trade. Now, does that mean that we should be hyper-protectionist in our approach to trade? I would argue no, but should we be cognizant of the fact that when you have some of those communities that are really exposed to trade, it can very often harm them, or at least cause some pretty negative consequences, even as it might cause some positive ones? I think we have to, and I think we have to accept that just because something is good economically, it may not be good for every single person in the community.
Yeah, and I think that it's very difficult to come up with a programmatic, this is what we have to do. You look at France right now, the French economy is sclerotic. It is in so much trouble. They could stand some reform to make the work rules a lot more flexible and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we certainly know that complete free trade globalism has been terrible for a lot of people, a lot of the working class and poor people. And I think that one good optimistic thing I can say is at least now we finally seem to be at a point where we can begin to have those conversations. And we have to thank Donald Trump for that. As crude as he's been, he's at least put this on the map. And I think your book has done a lot too. For people who I think Trump is horrible, they can at least read your book and start to think about that, you know, we're all in this together. And globalism, it was sold to us as a panacea. I remember being at the Dallas Morning News, right? I'd just gotten there in 2003 to join the editorial board. We had a group come in of ambassadors from Latin America and also a representative from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to talk about some free trade agreement they were going to add to NAFTA. And they were telling us in the editorial board meeting, said we've only got one real strong opponent in Mexico here, and it's the farmers around the border, because they're going to be wiped out by this. But really, you know, they've had their day, and we need to just we can deal with them. And I remember thinking, wow, these are people, these are really wealthy elites in government and business who don't even see how the community that comes with farming, the agricultural community, holds everything together. These are just, to them, these farmers were nothing but obstacles to economic progress. And I thought that is an incredibly short-sighted way to see things. And I don't know quite how we get to a point of thinking more holistically about our economy, but I think that the turmoil that we are seeing now and will continue to see because of globalism and the fallout of globalism is going to force some of the best thinkers who want to help the market adapt to this new reality to do those things.
Yeah, and just one other real quick thought to that is that, you know, especially on the right, we often hear some version of the free market is the best anti-poverty tool in the history of the world. And it is undoubtedly the case that the market economy has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But the idea that the free market system is good and is better for the impoverished than the alternatives does not necessarily mean that the system always produces winners and never produces losers. And we very often get caught in making that leap between this is the best social system that's out there to this is a perfect social system that is a panacea for every single one of society's ills. And I think we have to resist and push back against that.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I noticed you mentioned Walker Percy, and in the library here, there's a book on Walker Percy, but you can't take it out. It has to be read in that meeting room because there's so few copies. It's called Diagnosing Modern Relays. And one of the things that he talks about is the loss of a personal sovereignty, that we're giving our sovereignty over to the they. They know better than we do how to repair a carburetor. They know better than we do how to fix a heart. They know better than we do how to analyze maybe my anxiety and my depression. And so it seems like in your Benedict option, from the little bit I heard about it tonight, that maybe you're saying that we should reclaim, in some way we should reclaim our sovereignty. Do I have that right? And if so, how? And incidentally, there's a Benedictine monastery right behind you across the lake, and Walter Percy's buried there.
Indeed he is, and I'm so glad that you asked that question because we do a thing in St. Francisville called the Walker Percy Weekend. First weekend in June, it's a festival of Walker Percy's ideas and Southern culture and literature, and one of the things we're going to be talking about at this year's Walker Percy Weekend, that's walkerpercyweekend.org, tickets are still available. One of the things we're going to talk about is the Benedict option and Walker Percy. And I think that one of the things that Percy was against was this cult of expertise, as you say. And I think that is definitely part of the Benedict option, because one of the things that is characteristic, I believe, of our contemporary culture is what I call the Grand Inquisitor. You know, from the Dostoevsky, from the Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor is a fable within the novel, but he gave people the relief from all their worries if they would just give their freedom over to him. You know, and that is presented as an evil thing in Dostoevsky, and I think that is something that we struggle with today too, that we perhaps we don't struggle with, and we ought to struggle with, the idea of expecting to be taken care of or giving ourselves over to the system and expecting certain outcomes without realizing that the system is people. You know, the system is that if you surrender your own individuality and your own agency to a system, you're going to get crushed, and we need to reclaim that agency. That's one of the things I like so much about JD's book, is he wrote about the structural problems, economically and otherwise, that afflicted the white working class where he's from, but he also refused to deny moral agency to his people. There's that great anecdote that you open with about working in the warehouse yourself that summer. Can you tell that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, this is an economy, this is a community that's been really hit hard by manufacturing job losses. But I worked in a tile warehouse, that paid a pretty solid wage, and a guy who was 19 years old and had every reason to work, and had even his pregnant girlfriend was given a job as a receptionist in the warehouse that I was working at. The guy just did not do he was unbelievably shifty. He just was. He didn't show up. He showed up late. He would take multiple 30-minute bathroom breaks every single shift, and eventually he was fired. And what really worried me is not that he was, fired, or not that he was a bad worker. Of course, that happens, right? Some people are lazy and some people aren't. What really bothered me is that he blamed the manager when he was fired. He could not see any connection between what he was doing and the fact that he just lost his job. It was, you did this to me. How can you do this to me and my girlfriend? And that lack of agency really worries me.
Thank you. One more up front.
Hello. I've been following this conversation between you both through online, and I was introduced to it from my classical homeschooling circles. And the amazing part about listening to the conversation in person is that it's parallel to a conversation I've heard all my life about the Black community and from my parents, and what integration did to the Black community. And I just thought that, just some notes, like you talked about the thesis of your book, Mr. Vance, about the upward mobility of white folks of middle America. And I've heard that term all my life. We have to be upwardly mobile. We have to be upwardly mobile how did we lose that sense of excellence? That was drilled into my head as a middle class black person. You must be excellent. You defeat racism by being excellent. Another thing is the opioid versus the crack epidemic and the broken families. All my life I heard, well, it was a moral, moral integrity. Those people lack moral integrity, or those people are criminal in their nature, or animal in their nature, as a justification for what's happening with crack and the destruction of black families. I've heard that all my life. Another thing I've heard from my parents is that they were able to become middle class because of housing programs of affirmative action. And I heard too that white people became more middle class because of the GI Bill. And so in the 80s, well, I'm thinking the 80s, I don't know, but the loss of social policies or safety nets or programs, I thought that was interesting conversation. And then another thing is, what it sounds like to me is a ghettoization of middle America. And it's like the ghettoization of black neighborhoods, it was a moral or, because you're immoral in nature, that's the reason. And it's like now we're hearing there are other reasons for things. But I agree, I love the Benedict option, I'm Catholic. I've been through, we recently went on a tour of Middle America and stopped at the Wendell-Berry Center, and I love Wendell-Berry and all of those things. And it's so parallel, it's the exact same story, and the fact that we don't see them as the same, that they're parallel stories, different causes and roots and all that kind of stuff, but it's a parallel story, that is interesting that they're never connected.
And so let me ask you, as sort of the last final comment of the night, can you try to connect some of these issues on race? And this is an issue that's very relevant for us in New Orleans, us at the University of New Orleans. What might you have to say about that, both of you, as a way of finishing off the evening?
I think it's bigger than race. It's not about race. It's bigger than race is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I agree with the
Sure.
moral theism, but it was tied into political power and economic power, and it seems like when white people were losing political power and economic power, now there's a problem with society. And also, to answer about the economics, like I've been reading a lot about distributism, and the idea of with having, with the Benedict option, having personal, economic, family, owner, producer kind of things. And that's what helped my family too. Like my grandfather had a real estate trust that he left us, and then now you have a real estate, something you could do with that. Like I'm a real estate, but anyway.
Sure.
Those ideas, bigger than race though.
Well, just a couple of comments. I mean, I've heard a lot of people who've told me, look, the story that you tell about white working class Americans and their struggles is very similar to my life as a black person. That is one of the most common things that I hear. And I think it does go to show that, look, there are a lot of similarities. And I think there's something to be gained for appreciating those similarities and recognizing that a lot of problems that in our political discourse, a political discourse that's largely driven by elites who, when they think poverty, they think black people, recognizing that a lot of these problems exist in a much broader swath of the country is just a good thing to recognize. Now, obviously, how white working class America and black working class America got to where they are is different. I think that there are different causes, there are different underlying drivers of what got them into the various situations that they're in. But I think there are a lot of similarities in what's going on in these communities now that you appreciate that they are really struggling. Maybe they're struggling for different historical reasons, but now that they're where they are, there should be a broad-based recognition that they're struggling from a lot of the same issues, and that frankly, a lot of the same things may help both communities or may hurt both communities at the same time. The very last point that I'll make, you mentioned the opioid addiction connection to the crack epidemic, and this has definitely been one of the enduring frustrations that I've had about the way that we talk about the crack epidemic, is that we really got it wrong back in the 70s and 80s when we talked about what was going on in the black community vis-a-vis crack. I think there was a lot of moral condemnation. There was a lot of sort of pure judgment, completely divorced from understanding. And I think that the opioid crisis gives us an opportunity to get it right. And I do think that the way that we talk about these issues is a lot better than the way that they were talked about when they were perceived to be a black problem. I think that's obviously partially the consequence of a racialized rhetoric back in the 70s and 80s. But I think that the fact that we got it wrong back in the 70s and 80s should not give us an excuse or a reason to try to get it wrong now, because it's just too big. There are too many people who are affected by it, and I think we should learn from a lot of the mistakes that we made with black Americans in the crack epidemic and apply them to how we deal with the opioid epidemic.
You know, it was, I think it was in the Times the other day that, or maybe the Wall Street Journal, that the death rate from opioids is 3 times what it was from crack at the height of the crack epidemic. So this thing is just enormous. I mean, enough about that. I think that the only way forward for the country, but especially for the country on race, is through the church. One of the reasons I love Russell Moore, the Southern Baptist pastor, is he's made a priority of racial reconciliation. He was born and raised around Biloxi, so he knows what the failures of the white church, at least, has been. And I think that we have to keep pushing for that and push through the demonizing rhetoric on both sides and try to find some way to seek our common humanity as Christians too, because if we as Christians can't get it together, how do we expect everybody else to get it together? And I think too that if you look at the statistics, the one thing that we can do, all of us, to make stronger families and stronger communities and lift people out of poverty is support marriage. Strengthen marriage, because there's no greater variable that to predict poverty or the idea of somebody being raised and staying in poverty than single parenthood, than being raised in a single parent family. And if the church can get its act together, black churches, white churches, Hispanic churches, and strengthen ties to each other and strengthen families and family life, I think that is something very practical that we can do right now. We can't solve all the problems of historical legacy and structural problems in the economy. They're important problems. But one thing every one of us can do in our own churches and neighborhoods is strengthen family through church.
Well, thank you both very much. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you. I don't know if y'all realize this, but Hillbilly Elegy is going to be a movie. Ron Howard's directing. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Oh, yeah. I'm just worried that we're running out of something to say. Yeah. No, you seem to be doing good. Okay.
I really appreciate your book, and I'm going to get yours.
Oh, great. Thank you.
I did